We're back here today at the Battenkill Valley Health Center with Kiana Gates, who is a licensed clinical social worker, and Meghan Knight, who is a registered mental health counselor. We're here to continue the conversation we began the other day about teen anxiety, but we're also going to be talking a bit about postpartum depression, and for that we're grateful to have Kiana with us today. And Kiana, help us get started here. I guess, can you tell us a little bit about what is postpartum depression in general, and why do some women experience it and others don't?
Yeah, thank you. So when we talk about postpartum, I like to refer to what I call PMADs, perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. So when people hear about postpartum, oftentimes their brain goes automatically to postpartum depression, but it's really a large spectrum of things. So perinatal is the time of conception until the year after you give birth. Mood disorders include depression, bipolar disorder, and psychosis. Anxiety disorders include generalized anxiety, panic, obsessive compulsive disorder, and PTSD, trauma, birth trauma, things like that. So really it's a pretty large spectrum. And to confuse things further, there's the baby blues that people refer to. So usually when you think about the baby blues, you're feeling down after giving birth, you're feeling more tired, anxious, things that kind of come with being a new parent. And really it's the time frame that differentiates a lot of these things. So baby blues, people look into like 2 weeks after you give birth. And if it continues past that, and severity, things like that, you're looking more to postpartum depression, anxiety, any of the other things that I mentioned. So a lot of the symptoms are similar to what you would see with typical depressive symptoms. Maybe you're feeling a little bit more irritable. The lack of sleep will also do that to you, but also feeling, maybe you're crying all the time, sense of worthlessness or guilt, or thoughts of hurting yourself or hurting the baby, things like that. Typical symptoms, but a lot of times you see it geared more towards the baby versus what you would see in other types of depression. Then what was your other question?
Is that a case of something that affects a lot of women or just a smaller percentage?
So it depends where you get your statistics from. So what I follow Postpartum Support International or Mass Gen Women's Health. That's where I get a lot of my information from. So according to those statistics, it's about, you're looking anywhere between like 15 to 20% of postpartum folks who will experience a PMAD, a perinatal mood or anxiety disorder, throughout their time giving birth.
And I was wondering, are there any potential indicators or, a sense that, a person who might have had some psychological issues in the past, they're more likely to have postpartum depression, or is it a case where, hey, it could just happen to anybody, and regardless of their past history?
Yeah, I also want to add about 10% of fathers can also experience postpartum, even though they're not the birthing person, but a lot of things also affect their life. In terms of who it can affect, PMADs, they don't discriminate. Anybody can experience any type of postpartum anxiety, depression after giving birth. There are some risk factors. If you already have a previous history of bipolar disorder, for example, you're more apt to be diagnosed like postpartum OCD. If you have a history of depression, perhaps there's an increased risk for postpartum depression. So there are some risk factors that contribute, or if you have a family history, maybe your mom had postpartum, or your grandmother or your sister, things like that. There are some risk factors, but generally they don't discriminate. And finances aren't a protective factor in that either. So PMADs affect all socioeconomic statuses across the board. So really there's a lot of varying research that says, in general, we don't really know the cause of postpartum. So there's not like a magic pill that we can be like, here you go, you can have this and you won't experience this. A lot of research has been done, and some research suggests that after you give birth, there's a dip in your hormones. So your estrogen, your progesterone, there's a dip in that. And some folks are more sensitive to hormonal changes than other people. So there's some research that suggests that that dip in hormones can have a higher likelihood of developing a PMAD, a perinatal mood or anxiety disorder, in the future, but there's just not enough research that really correlates that to answer the whole picture of why folks get them. I think sleep, social support, other things impact it as well.
I also wonder think about what role the societal expectations have in, a mother feeling like, I have this new baby and I'm supposed to feel like this intense love, and I'm supposed to feel this way because society tells us that this is how we are kind of genetically wired to feel about our baby. And if we don't, and if we do feel overwhelm, and we do feel sort of like this anxiety about how am I going to take care of this person, I feel like those conflicted emotions also could potentially play a role into a diagnosis.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of guilt, shame, and stigma that particularly goes with postpartum. When I want to say like pregnant and parenting people, because it's not always women. Like, there's also folks who adopt, and people who are surrogates, for example, or you go through IVF, so it can affect different populations as well. But yes, I always tell folks that I work with, like, setting realistic expectations is really important, especially with social media, and you only see a small glimpse into these people's lives, but it's like, well, if they can make their kid homemade banana bread and cookies and brownies for their kid's class, like, I should be able to do that and work a full-time job and be an astronaut and a scientist. And it's like, that's just not realistic. Not everybody can do, not everybody has the same window of tolerance. So it varies, but I think that does contribute a lot to it. And that's where you distinguish like the depression and the anxiety, right? So when I say postpartum depression, that's kind of the, feeling very tired, loss of pleasure in things, anhedonia, maybe you're sleeping more. Highly unlikely if you have a new baby. Maybe your appetite has changed. You don't want to go see friends. You're isolating. Those are more depressive symptoms. Anxiety is like, oh my gosh, I got to make sure the baby's fed. The baby's not going to be fed. Like you're feeling very overly concerned about something bad's going to happen to the baby. I got to make sure I'm with them all the time. Things like that. You're getting into the car and you're nervous about driving. Perinatal OCD, we see a lot more, like checking I see a lot of, like checking to make sure the baby's breathing, checking to make sure the baby's breathing. Or even things like being afraid that their formula is contaminated and you're afraid to feed your baby. Things like that is more like perinatal OCD. And then psychosis is, having thoughts that are not based in reality, and that requires medical attention.
So, what should someone who's struggling with this do then? Would your recommendation be to, go see a doctor or someone who can help with that, or do you just sort of tough it out?
Do not do that. Do not tough it out. Don't do that. There's a lot of different options that are actually available that people don't know about. So I am certified in perinatal mental health through Postpartum Support International, and I'm on the board here in Vermont, and I run the helpline for Battenkill County. So you can always call Postpartum Support International. I have their hotline number here. It's 1-800-944-4773. You can always call that number for support and resources near you. Since I'm the volunteer for this area, you'll probably be connected to me. Another really great area of resource is your OBGYN provider, your midwife, your doula, whoever you went to for postpartum care, and whoever birthed your child. Tell them what's going on with you. See if they can connect you to somebody if you don't feel comfortable reaching out to Postpartum Support International. Talking to your primary care doctor is another really good option. Mass Gen has a women's perinatal mental health, like a research group, and they have a really robust website that you could visit that has all sorts of blog posts, research articles. They do a lot of research about perinatal mental health. So if you're like, I struggled with postpartum anxiety, I don't think there's enough awareness about this, I want to help other people struggling with the same, participate in a research study so people can get more information and have more of an understanding about what's going on. And sometimes there's opportunities for support groups. There's a lot of support groups. Postpartum Support International has a support group for anything you can possibly imagine. They have loss support groups. They have postpartum anxiety, psychosis, bipolar disorder, BIPOC support groups, all sorts of different things. Toddlers are a beast of their own. They have support groups for folks who are raising toddlers. And there's also the National Mental Health Support Line. That number is 1-833-943-5746, and you can call that at any time and speak to a licensed or registered counselor as well and get support. So those are just a few things. I have more, but to start us off with.
I would also maybe add, if there is a partner involved or loved one, to be sort of aware of symptoms and have, the support, the natural social support if there is a partner, even if there isn't a loved one or a social support, to be sort of looking out for some of the symptoms that Kiana was talking about, and be encouraging for the person to be able to seek outside resources.
Yeah. And one of the things that I do, I previously worked with the pregnant and postpartum patient in a clinical setting. So what I did before was counsel the partner, the support system on the symptoms, just so they're aware of them, because they're going to see them before the birthing person does, and what to look for and how to approach the person. You're not going to be like, hey Meg, you are really cranky, you need to go get some help, right? Like how to approach it and how to come off in a gentle, kind way and let them know that you're supportive. But the approach I use for therapy is interpersonal psychotherapy. So that is utilizing your support system, your network, who's there for you, things like that. So that's a really big piece.
Well, Meghan, it sounds like some of the symptoms that Kiana's describing here sound like they also could apply to teenagers as they progress through there. So I wanted to bring you into this. What is going on as kids transition into the teenagehood and further? There's a lot physiologically and psychologically going on as well, clearly, as we all remember.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a fascinating time. I think
That's one way of putting it.
Yes. It is. It really is. And I think that, first and foremost, the roles of the adults in the adolescent life are very instrumental in being that support and sort of being able to look at adolescence and approach it in a way that is just that, and that there is so much change going on. Previously, we thought adolescence had a lot to do with hormones and hormones changing and surging. And we know now that it has a lot more to do with actually the architecture and the function of the brain changing, and different portions of their brain changing at different rates. And so, we as a society, again, always kind of say like, oh, the hormones are raging. Well, they are, but it really has sort of a lot more to do with that brain structure and function and how that's changing.
So is that like the addition of more brain cells or something like that? Is there something like that going on, or we're born with all the brain cells we're ever going to have until they start dying off as you get to a certain age, and the brain is just simply those existing cells are already changing?
It's really multifaceted. There's connections being made. When I talk with kids and parents, I often talk about the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain. And the upstairs brain, a lot of the function happens here in sort of like behind our foreheads. And that's where a lot of the reasoning, the logic, and sort of making connections happens. The upstairs brain sort of rationalizes with our downstairs brain. Our downstairs brain is sort of responsible. It's very primitive. It's kind of responsible for keeping us safe. It was responsible for keeping us safe when we were, prehistoric beings, and knowing and sensing danger.
Fight or fight.
Yes, yes, exactly. And so the adolescent stage is a lot of reconstruction going on in this rationalizing part of our brain that is helping to connect the emotions to the logic. And if you think about like a construction zone, sometimes we have to pull the electricity off to build a new part of the building, and sometimes that's what's happening, and that's where we see a little bit of the impulsive actions, or driving too fast, and sort of the parts of ourselves aren't always talking to each other, but it's because it's growing. This part of our brain isn't fully developed until we're about 25.
Yeah.
Or in some cases longer.
Men is actually later, so that explains a lot, I think. And I'll add to Meg too, one thing I like to use is, I call it flipping your lid, and Dr. Dan Siegel developed this hand model of the brain. So what Meg is referring to right here, this is your prefrontal cortex, which isn't developed until like in your early 20s for women, later 20s, or never for men. So when you are socially engaged, your brain is kind of connected, your prefrontal cortex is down, is engaged with the bottom half of your brain. This is your amygdala, this is your brainstem. When you get activated, something happens. I take my paper and I chuck it at Meg's face. What she could do is keep these two engaged and throw this back to me and say, hey, I didn't like that, try again. Or she could flip her lid. And when you flip your lid, your amygdala, which produces all of our fun hormones like adrenaline, cortisol, all these fun things that get us activated, when that's open, it's no longer protecting our downstairs brain. So that's when I call it flipping your lid, when Meg takes these colored pencils and chucks them at me instead of being able to tell me she didn't like when I threw my paper at her. So I think that's a helpful thing to show kiddos as well.
Interesting. I wanted to explore a little bit this whole social media question as well. Kiana, you talked about this as well, but that's such a big difference today compared to earlier eras that I'm more familiar with. But it just seems like social media in general has had a tremendous impact on all of us, but particularly it seems like, from what I read, on teenagers. And why is that? What are the dynamics going on there that makes it such a powerful force for teens to utilize productively and contend with, on the other hand?
Yeah, I think it's definitely within the last 10 to 20 years, we've definitely seen this introduction of social media. We know that adolescence is a time of really integrating peer connections, and we see like kind of a shift away from the parental figures and more sort of more interest in friends and our friends, what our friends are doing. And that builds a lot of who they are as adults. And so social media has been just sort of this way of connecting to a much broader population for kids, and seeking that social connection, but it's in a media format which is much different from the in-person connections that they're making, that adolescents are making during this time. And in social media, it's easy to make yourself appear much different than how you're feeling, what's really going on in your life. And so this sense of this kind of a little bit false reality. And again, a little bit going back to like the postpartum things, like, oh, this is what I'm supposed to look like, or this is how my life is supposed to look. And sort of having that disconnect, and then just so much unlimited access without the in-person body language that we're learning, which is so important, and those social cues that the social media piece kind of doesn't have. And so having the parent support and the adult support there to say, to kind of reinforce those ideas that what we see online or how we exist online and in social media might not always be an accurate portrayal of sort of what's going on behind the scenes. And I think that that's really important piece to be able for adolescents to be able to say, like, hey, this is what I saw, and being able to kind of back that up with the in-person support, both peer and adult.
Is there anything you think the technology companies should do to try and help alleviate that? Or is that just really a question of, on the individual level or local school level, perhaps? That's really the front line of it all, and that's where the solution is to whatever negative things come out of this.
Right.
Along with all the positive stuff, let me hasten to add. Can be found. Or is there something that, Facebook and Instagram and all the other companies, Snapchat and TikTok, and
the list goes on.
Could do.
I mean, yes, in a perfect world with a magic wand, I mean, having more restrictions, but on the media world on that end would be wonderful. But I don't foresee that happening in the near future. So being able to navigate it again, like I was saying, on the individual level, backing, digital citizenship, having the conversations at home. Why is it easier to say something mean to somebody online than it is to say it in person? How do we solve problems? We solve problems by talking to each other and communicating with each other. But it is just easier to send, kind of a nasty text. But that will happen. And I think you brought up a good point too. There is a real positive aspect of the social media, because adolescence is a time of tremendous growth as far as creativity and finding new norms, and kind of a change from how they used to operate as children, and now moving into this kind of innovative way. And I think social media is actually a really good way to be able to harness that creativity and that innovation that's developing throughout adolescence. And I think that's another really good way for parents and adults to be able to sort of harness it, is like how to use it in a positive light, and how to use your great brain to be creative and show, how you can, your wonderful art or your sculptures or your photography. I see kids who are on TikTok who are wonderful photographers, and the editing that they do is amazing, and sort of harnessing that and encouraging that kind of stuff, and then having those conversations about, something hurtful that was said or something, and how and approaching it with curiosity, really.
Before we have to run, I just wanted to ask you both a question. You both touched, I think, on this point earlier, and that's the whole question around stigma. It seems like there's so much stigma attached to so many things, people's problems of one kind or another. But I wondered if you had thoughts on how the stigma around postpartum depression or anxiety among teenagers can be recognized and understood for what it really is, which is just sort of often very poorly formed opinions based on incorrect information or just rivalries of one sort or another. I mean, is there anything you both could say to that point about how do we reverse the whole question around stigma?
I don't think there's a way to reverse it, but how can we improve it, right? I think just providing accurate information, like you said. Be careful with your language. I think some people use language like, oh my gosh, you're so crazy, or oh, you're so OCD. Like they say things like that, and they think it's not a big deal, but it is. I think that contributes to the stigma. People say like, oh, you're so crazy. People sometimes take that to heart, and if they are struggling, well, I can't go see a therapist because that means I'm crazy or whatever it might be. So just be careful with your language. Be educated around like what that really means. What really are these mental health disorders? Social media, there was a big thing going around where people would come to me like, I think I'm diagnosed with this and this and this. Okay, well, why do you think that? Well, on TikTok, this kid who lives in North Carolina said X, Y, and Z. Okay, well, let's review what that actually means and what it means to be diagnosed with that. So I think that's a big piece of it. And just normalize going to your therapist. If you broke your leg, right, you would go to the emergency room to get a cast on your leg, I would hope. If you're having a panic attack, an anxiety attack, a mental health crisis, I would hope you would also go to the emergency room in the same way, right? If you have diabetes, you're going to take your insulin and you're going to go see your endocrinologist. The same is true with mental health. If you have anxiety or depression, go see your mental health provider, go see your psychiatrist regularly. If you're going to take medications, right, you would do it for your diabetes, same thing for your mental health. It shouldn't be different. So.
And I would just follow that up with, the education piece of it and sort of being able to understand your body, and understand what's happening. Anxiety serves a purpose for us. Sometimes with our development as humans, it can sort of become maladaptive, but like I was saying earlier, like that part of our brain that kind of is responsible for anxiety and for a lot of different reasons, is there to keep us safe. It's there to keep us safe and keep us out of danger. It's there for a purpose. But understanding it on a level of like, okay, sometimes my anxiety doesn't tell me the truth, or sometimes my thoughts don't tell me the truth, and sort of understanding why that is. But our body is serving purposes for us, and that sort of logical approach to mental health, I think, can be very helpful for adolescents. Certainly, talking about this stuff in schools, and I know that's happening a lot more, and, providing the support and encouraging, talk about how you're feeling, talk to somebody, talk to a friend who's going to then talk to an adult. If you don't have an adult that you feel comfortable talking with, that's another huge protective factor for an adolescent, is to be able to have a trusted adult to be able to confide in.
Such important subjects. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there for today, but I feel like we talked about both of these areas for quite a long time. But just wanted to thank Kiana Gates and Meghan Knight for being with us today to talk about these important issues. And well, we hope you found our program interesting, and we'll be back the next time when we bring another edition of our new series on health and wellness. Meanwhile, have a great day. Thank you.